Welcome, everyone. My name is Jen Hoyer, and I'm coming to you virtually today from Brooklyn Public Library's Center for Brooklyn History. Our education team here supports New York City educators and students through professional development workshops, classroom visits, after-school visits, and online resources. We are also very excited this year to be the host of the 2021 New York City History Day contest. Brooklyn Public Library Center for Brooklyn History stands on land that is part of the unceded ancestral homeland of the Lenape Delaware people. As a sign of respect, we recognize and honor the Lenape Delaware nations, their elders past and present, and future generations. We're committed to addressing exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples and confronting the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism in our work. I want to start off today by just reviewing a few housekeeping details. Participants will be kept muted for the duration of today's presentation. During Q&A at the end, I'll respond to as many questions as I'm able to. Feel free to put questions in the chat throughout, and I will also keep my eye on that to try to answer some questions as we go if I can. We shouldn't run much over 30 minutes today. We may even wrap up before that, but I will be hanging around afterwards if there are additional questions. The Center for Brooklyn History's education online events are intended to create a space that nurtures a community of educators and that is inclusive of all, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender identity, religion, age, sexual orientation, ability, or stage of professional development. All attendees are expected to show respect to presenters, organizers, and other attendees. We ask you to actively listen, to be sensitive, and to show support. Attendees who violate this code of conduct will be removed. If you haven't done so already, you can change your name and pronouns by clicking on participants at the bottom of your screen. And then when the participant list shows up on the right, you can hover over your name. You'll then see a button to rename yourself. If you click on that, you can type your name as you would like it to appear, including pronouns such as they, them, he, her, he, his, or she, her. We're committed to ensuring that all of our events, activities, and materials are accessible to all individuals, including individuals with disabilities. So captioning is available during today's session and can be enabled by clicking on the CC closed caption icon in the bottom of your window. Please get in touch with us with your preferred method of communication at connections@bklynlibrary.org if you require other accessibility accommodations. And finally, I want to make sure everyone is aware that this session is being recorded, and it will be shared after the session concludes. So by participating with your camera on, there is the possibility that your image would be recorded, and you have consented to that. If you don't consent to being recorded with your picture in the Zoom box, please turn your camera off and refrain from verbally sharing questions. You can share those questions in that chat, which will not be saved. All right, well, let's dive into what we're talking about today. Our objectives today are to understand best practices for citing sources, to understand what an annotated bibliography is, and to explore what National History Day requires for an annotated bibliography. Let's take a quick pause here to talk about New York City History Day, because today's workshop is offered in conjunction with History Day. We're really thrilled that the Center for Brooklyn History is the host of New York City History Day in 2021, and this year's contest is free and entirely virtual for 6th through 12th grade students. New York City History Day is the regional program for National History Day, a contest that provides over 500,000 students each year the opportunity to excel at historic research, interpretation, and creative expression. Top entries will be invited to advance to state and national contests. And as in previous years, students can enter in a variety of categories: papers, performances, documentaries, exhibits, and websites. I'll highlight a few things here. History Day 2021 opened registration on January 25th. That was this past Monday, and registration will close on March 2nd. The entire contest is virtual, which means that projects must be submitted online by the registration deadline, March 2nd. Full instructions for creating and submitting those virtual projects, as well as all of these other details, are on our website, bklynlib.org/NYCHD. And I will send that link via email afterwards as well. So diving back into our objectives and diving back into citing our sources. First of all, why do we cite our sources? I think it's important to cite our sources in order to give credit where credit is due, to prove the validity of our information, to help others follow the path of our research, and because it is expected throughout high school and college and beyond. Which leads us to my next big question of how do we cite our sources? When I think about how I cite sources, I think about how we give people directions to find something. If I want someone to find directions to my home, I might give them my address. I might give them a set of streets to look for, maybe an intersection. I might tell them, take this street and then turn this way, and then this street and this way. If I want someone to find me in a crowded place, I might say, look for these characteristics. I'm tall and I have long red hair and I'm wearing glasses and I have a big scarf on today. Or if I'm telling someone to find a book for me in the library, like, hey, you're going to the library, can you check out this book for me that I need for my project? I might say, this is the color of the cover, this is the title, this is the author, it's really fat, it's really skinny. And citing our sources really just is giving people directions to where we got the information in our research. When we cite our sources, usually we look for a standard set of as many as possible of the following elements. This list of elements is created by the Modern Languages Association, who created the MLA citation format. You might have heard that before if you've done citations before. If not, no big deal. But we look for the author, so the person who created the thing. For a photograph, that might actually be the photographer, but for a book, we would usually call that person the author. We look for the title of our source. So that's the name of a book, the name of a painting, the name of a record album. Sometimes we also look for the title of the container. And this sounds confusing until you think about what a container is. A container is something that you put other things inside of. And some sources live inside a different thing. So if my source is a newspaper article, my title of the source is the title of my newspaper article. But I also need to tell people what newspaper it's from, and that's the container that my article lives inside. So the title of that container in that case might be the New York Times, whereas my source title is the article specifically. Other containers you might be familiar with are encyclopedias, which contain a lot of little articles, or we could think about compilations of essays or other kinds of things. The next thing we look at is other contributors. So those might be translators or illustrators. We can also look to see if there's a version or a number. I'll have an example of something later that has a version, but a version might be, this is the 10th edition, this is the 4th reprint, this is the anniversary edition, the editor's cut. And that's important to know. If I use the editor's cut for something, it might have extra footage that I cited, and I need to make that clear. The number would be something like episode 22, season 3. Those are important details to give as well if we're giving directions to our source. A publisher is the company that produces our source. So for a book, a publisher is responsible for things like printing and distributing and marketing something. Publishers that you might be familiar with could be Scholastic or Pearson or Random House. A publication date is when the item was published. And a location is where it was published. It's not necessarily where the author lives or where they worked. It's usually where the publisher is located. After we find as many of those as possible, and we won't ever find all of them, but we'll find as many as we can, we format our citation. And the format, this is very general, will usually look something along these lines. This is the most general format. A last name and then first name, and then a title, and we see here the titles in italics, a place, and then a semicolon, a publisher, a comma, and a year of publication, and then finally a period. And when you find the format that you should use for your item, copying all of these details, the italics, the colons, semicolons, commas, periods, that's really important because that's part of the directions. People understand when they see something in italics, so that's the title. Or they understand when they see a period at the end that that's the end of all the details. So all of those formatting elements are really important. Before we look at some examples of citations, I want to mention that there are two formats for citing sources that are approved for National History Day. The National History Day rulebook is the place to check for all of the elements of your project. And I have the link for it here. We'll also take a look at it in a moment, but I cut out a piece of the rulebook and put it on my slide here. It says, citations and bibliographic references must follow the most recent edition of one of the two permitted style guides below. Regardless of which manual you use, the style must be consistent throughout all the written material. So it says the Chicago Manual of Style or the MLA Handbook. And you might have heard before from your teacher of doing MLA citations or Chicago citations. Let's take a look at the NHD rulebook and see where Rule 20 is over here. And I'm going to quickly do a control find for Rule 20. Here we go. And let's take a look at this on my screen. So this is the section I cut out, and it actually says a little bit more down below. It says, note, historians prefer the Chicago Manual of Style, which is to say, if you become a professional historian, it's probably the format that you'll use. Because its footnote and endnote formatting works best for historical sources. However, NHD accepts the MLA handbook because of its widespread use in many schools. So if that's what you're comfortable with, if that's what you've done in other classes, it's totally, totally okay to use MLA formatting. All right. Where can I find more resources for citing my sources? This is a place where your teacher or librarian may actually have really good suggestions that they want you to use. They might have created some resources for you. They might have websites that they've told you to look at. I usually look at this website called OWL at Purdue. And it outlines lots of different citation styles. I'm going to follow Chicago today. And it gives me a lot of details here. It always has these pop-up videos. They're not annoying ad pop-up videos. They're videos about how to do Chicago citations, but they do tend to pop up a lot. And so under Chicago style, there's a whole long introduction. And there are always some sample papers that you can look at here, but I usually go straight over down here to the general format. And I look to see if it has the examples of what I'm looking for. So for example, for a book, it gives me the format, very similar to the format we just looked at on our slide. I can see that there's examples for periodicals, like magazines, there's examples for web sources, etc. And thanks for this great comment in the chat. A lot of databases also have citation tools. So if you find something in a database, you can often click on Cite this source, and you can usually choose, I want the citation in MLA format, in Chicago format, something like that. And it will give you a citation to copy and paste. So make sure you save those as you do your work. So let's try one out. We're going to try citing this book. It's a very large book. I have it sitting beside me, but I have a picture of it on my slide. I thought this might be a really handy source if I was doing research. And when I open this book, I want to talk a little bit about where I find all the details I need for a citation. Some of it I actually might find on the spine. It's where I can see the title. Some I might find on the cover. But I also find a lot of this information when I open the book up. On the left-hand side of your screen, you can see what we would call the inside title page. And on the back of that, I have a lot of details. I put that on the right of your screen about where it was published, when it was published, and I can see some interesting things here. So I have the title, King's Views of New York, 1896 to 1915, and Brooklyn, 1905. You can see it was compiled by Moses King. So I'm going to call him the author. It was published by Arno Press in New York in 1980. And when I look at this publishing information on the back of that inside title page, it tells me, well, it was actually first published in Boston in 1896, but this reprint edition, and remember, this is an edition, came out in 1980. So I collect as many of the elements as I can find. For this one, I found an author, a title, a date and an edition, a publisher, and a location. And then how should I format it? Well, I went back over to the Chicago website and I copied the general model for citing books in the Chicago Notes and Bibliography system. Chicago will always give you a format if you're doing a footnote or endnote and a format for the bibliography entry. You can stick for NYCHD, you can stick with using the format for a bibliography entry. And then we cite our source. And so here, I think some of my Google Slides info is covering it. There we go. At the bottom, I've put those details that I found into the format that is given to me by Chicago, and highlighted down here at the bottom of my screen is my full citation. So King, comma, Moses, period. And I have the whole title in italics, and then I added in reprint edition. And I have the place of publication is New York, then Arno Press, comma, 1980, period. But hold on a minute. What if I'm not citing this whole source? What if I don't do a lot of research, like using information throughout the book? What if I'm citing one specific illustration, maybe a primary source that I include in my project? I imagined that I was doing research on the Brooklyn Bridge, because I often imagine that I am doing research on the Brooklyn Bridge. And so I flipped through and I saw this amazing illustration of the Brooklyn Bridge at the bottom of page 8. You can actually zoom in and see it a little closer here in my grainy photograph. And this might be a primary source that I would want to reproduce in my National History Day project. And so in my bibliography, I would want to make it clear that I'm citing this source and not the entire book. So now I need to rethink, what elements can I find? Well, I still have my author, but the title of this is the Brooklyn Bridge. And I can see that right under here. It might be kind of tiny on your screens, I apologize, but it says the title underneath the image. So the title is the Brooklyn Bridge. I looked and did not see an additional author for this. So I still put Moses King as the author. And now what we previously used as the title is the title of the container. The rest of the details are the same, but I did make note of the page that this is located on. And so for this, I actually formatted my citation using formatting for an image in a book. And I think this may be the kind of situation that you find yourself in for some of the primary sources you decide to cite. And so this is very similar to what I previously did, but I did cite that actual source, the Brooklyn Bridge in quotation marks, in King's Views of New York. There's my italics, title of container by Moses King, page 8, reprint edition, New York, Arno Press, 1980. Let's take a look at one more example before we talk about annotations. I think that this example is the kind of source that you may be using a lot this year for National History Day, because we're doing a lot of our research online. So this is a illustration, a drawing from the Library of Congress collections. So I found this online, and when I went to this webpage, which you can go to by clicking on this link at the bottom, if I scroll down, this is all the information that appears below the source. So this is amazing because this looks like what I'm looking for when I look for the elements to give directions to my source. I have a title up here. I don't see an author specifically listed. Beside the title, it says from a sketch by a staff artist, which not very specific. I'm not going to put a staff artist for the author in this case. Some people might choose to, but I am not going to. One thing that's really interesting is this only comes under the notes. It says it's an illustration, that's what ILLUS stands for, in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. So that's where I realized, oh, this is like the last thing where I have a larger container that my source exists within. This newspaper is literally called Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. I can see it at the top here. This was a really popular newspaper in New York City. So it appeared in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper in 1883 on April 28th on page 149. And those square brackets around the 149, that just means we don't actually see 149 on the page. They probably didn't want to like mess up the picture, but the next page has the number 150 on it, so it's pretty safe to assume this is 149. All right, so let's take a look at what elements we can find. I didn't have an author, but I have a title, New York, completing a great work, latching the stays of the Brooklyn Bridge. The title of the container is that it's an illustration in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. I have a date and a page. So how should I format this? Well, I went to OWL at Purdue again, and I found the format for a magazine because that's what a newspaper is very similar to a magazine. This was the formatting under periodicals, which refers to magazines, newspapers, other things that come out periodically. And I can see that for the bibliography entry, I put the last name and then first name of the author. I put the title of the item itself in quotation marks, and then the title of the periodical in italics, followed by the date. So I took all of my elements and I put them into this highlighted citation at the bottom. I don't have an author to start with, but I have in quotation marks the title of this illustration, and in italics, the title of the periodical, and then the date and the page number. I did also add in the URL, the hyperlink at the end of this. That is often suggested for things that we find online. And then finally, we are at the very last step. And personally, this is the part that I love. Finally, we add an annotation. So on the National History Day website, it says, an annotated bibliography is required for all National History Day contest categories. Creating an annotated bibliography lets your reader know what sources you used in the creation of your project. First, an annotated bibliography tells the reader how many sources you used and the quality and range of sources used in your research. It provides evidence of the many hours that you spent doing research in libraries, archives, classrooms, and on the internet. And second, the annotation informs the reader about how you used your sources and why they were valuable to understanding your topic. An annotated bibliography is crucial to the NYCHD process because it shows judges the scope and depth of your research. So an annotation is all about proving that you did some really careful thinking and thoughtful analysis when you looked at each of your sources. But I follow this simple formula. First, I summarize some key points. What is the source about? Why is it a good source? And why did I decide to use this source? And then I write 2 or 3 sentences to combine all of that into an annotation. So let's try it out with this last example we looked at. So what is this source about? I wrote, this illustration shows work on cables of the Brooklyn Bridge. Why is it a good source? This is a good source because it was created at the time this was happening to show local residents what was going on. It also portrays the conditions of workers and the safety equipment they did or did not make use of. And why did I decide to use this source? I decided to use this source because I feel that it is one of the best depictions of work conditions on this part of the Brooklyn Bridge. And then I can just take that and put it together into my annotation following my citation. So in my bibliography, it would have my citation that we already made. And then I combined my responses to my 3 questions into this paragraph. This illustration from an illustrated newspaper in New York City shows work on the cables of the Brooklyn Bridge. This is a good source because it was created at the time this was happening to show local residents what was going on. Moreover, it portrays the conditions of workers and the safety equipment they did or did not make use of. I decided to use this source because I feel that it is one of the best depictions of work conditions on this part of the Brooklyn Bridge. And before we wrap up, what else should we know? National History Day has a few other guidelines. This is taken from NYCHD.org/annotated-bibliography. I'll be sharing this afterwards so you can take a look yourself. We want to make sure our bibliography is titled Annotated Bibliography. And this is perhaps the most important, we want to divide that annotated bibliography in 2 sections, one labeled primary sources and the second labeled secondary sources. So we need to separate our primary and secondary sources in our annotated bibliography. That's something really specific to National History Day. And then within each of those sections, we alphabetize the entries by the first word, excluding things like a, an, or the. There's some other suggestions, but we'll finish up by looking at an example. There are some project examples on the National History Day website. I'll share this as well in follow-up. I love looking at these as a way to explore what people have done really well. And you can look at past winners from different categories. I have one open here that is a project that was entered last year. And in 2020, the national contest was virtual, just like this year, which means that exhibits like this one were entered virtually. They were entered mostly using Google Slides or other similar templates. So for this, we actually see the whole presentation first, and then I'm going to skip over to, where are we? Our annotated bibliography comes down here at the end, and we can see they've done exactly what those instructions said. It's titled Annotated Bibliography, and then we see our primary sources first. We see the citation, followed by an annotation. It's just 3 sentences. It tells what it is, what it was used for, and why it was helpful for their project. And then we go on to our next source. So they have a very long annotated bibliography here. Looking at some of these project examples is a really terrific way to get a sense of what makes a successful annotated bibliography.